Delighted to be here with everybody. Hello, everyone. I really appreciate the introduction that Chitra provided. And what I thought I would do for the next 20, 25 minutes is sort of give you a quick rundown of almost my resume. So you can see the staging of the career over the course of time. And in order to make it interesting, and maybe somebody could, Chitra, if I could get screen sharing if possible. Um, if so, I'll actually bring up my resume. And what I was thinking was I would tell you how much money I made at each stage of my career and tell you how I negotiated my big comp increases and how actually I started to think about money differently over the course of my career. So let's see if I can share. If I can, I'll do it with my resume. Otherwise, we'll just do it verbally here. Looks like I can share.
So you should be able to share.
Yep, wonderful. All right, so I'll start at the bottom here. Chitra told you about my school stuff. So the only thing I'll mention there is that I came to the US having grown up in a family of like 40 plus doctors and with a great passion for my country to go back to India. My vision and goal was that I would go back to India, have an arranged marriage, by the way, into my traditional Sikh community, get rich, learn how to run a business, and then go run for office. And I wanted to try to make and create social change because of the nature of my upbringing. And so we'll talk about how that all changed. So what I decided to do after Princeton was I thought I would get a job at McKinsey because McKinsey was quite famous in India. And I thought, this is a great way to learn business, but in almost like a school because you do a bunch of work across a variety of industries. So I managed to get my first job at McKinsey and Company in LA. And my starting salary, I think, was, I'm going to give you approximate numbers, 42,000. So I would say in 1996, 97, I probably made about $50,000 between base and bonus. And that was the starting point for my career. So I did that for a couple of years. And then I decided, like a good little Indian, that I should run off to business school and get a master's degree and not take too long, do it as quickly as possible, which, by the way, in retrospect, I think I've completely changed my view on that. And I don't think one needs to be in a hurry for anything because life is not running away. And in retrospect, I wish I'd taken more time, and I wish I had not done the turbo MBA where you go to Northwestern, and if you had a business background, you do it all in 4 quarters instead of 6. In retrospect, I think the second year would have been lovely. I could have traveled abroad and I could have made deeper friendships and taken more time. So I do McKinsey for a couple of years, and I think let me go off to business school. And I would tell you just this was sort of the moment where my journey, also shifted personally, because I had sort of grown up thinking I was straight and really not really realizing there was any other option, candidly. But feeling attracted to, like the Bollywood actresses. So the Indians around will sort of, laugh a little bit. But around when I came to work at McKinsey as a business analyst, I met somebody here in Los Angeles, and started to realize that I had found my soulmate, and the soulmate was in a different body than I'd expected. And so all of this journey then started, and I went off to business school, did my MBA, and McKinsey had already given me an offer. So I knew I could come back to McKinsey and make, I don't remember, 120,000 to 25,000 base plus bonus. So call it 150 total cash. So you can get an understanding of what a business degree can buy you and what those roles paid. So I had that option. McKinsey paid for business school. So I decided to come back for a couple of years and became an associate at McKinsey. Chitra mentioned the LGBT thingy, so I'll sort of mention that here. When I came back to McKinsey from Kellogg, I also hit a personal inflection point where I decided that I basically had to abandon my entire vision for going back to. Actually, I had discovered my truth, and I was going to live my truth. And so that basically eradicated all India options because I was promptly chucked out of my, relatively traditional Sikh family, which had great aspirations for me. And I was, standing on the shoulders of many generations of people who'd worked hard, making sort of the American, which was very, very challenging. But it set me on a path to then build a career within the US because options to go back to India and all of that had to be sort of rethought. And my long vision, 20, 30-year vision was destroyed. Make decisions much more based on what was going on in my life at that particular moment. So I'll sort of fast forward. I did pretty well at McKinsey. I was, quote unquote, high performing, and we'll talk about leadership and how to be successful. And one of the key things always is be good at what you do. That is not a sufficient factor to be successful. It's necessary, but not sufficient. In order for really strong performance to translate into success, financial and otherwise, you actually have to be able to communicate that, be in the right place, number one, but also able to communicate that above the organization. But nonetheless, that does make a big difference. So I was successful at McKinsey, and I was trying to make partner there. But I remember going to a dinner at one point, which was hosted by the guy who used to lead the LA office. And I found out after a while there was some awkwardness at the dinner, and I realized that my then girlfriend and I, or fiance and I, had been moved to a different table because this Caucasian gentleman who was the leader of our office didn't really want to be around us. So, when we think about sort of microaggressions or issues, that happened. It did not affect my career at McKinsey, by the way. I was still considered very successful, but it gave me the feeling, something wasn't right. And then something else happened, actually. And in retrospect, I made a decision very quickly when the second thing happened. And I could have really sort of made McKinsey my own, because I think the firm is very different and you can have many different careers there, as is true for many organizations. But one of my dearest friends died when I was trying to make associate partner. And I had this big meeting with the CEO of the second largest hospital chain in America, and I'd been leading these hospital turnarounds. And Achal, one of my best friends from business school, died in a freak accident. And I won't take you into the whole long story, but long story short, I was faced with the decision of whether to go to the meeting with this CEO, which would be a career building meeting, or whether to go to my friend's funeral. And what I did was I asked the partner who was working with me, what I should do. And he suggested that I should go to the meeting. And so I went to the meeting, and I came home, and I decided that I want to leave McKinsey. If McKinsey makes me the kind of person that now chooses career or money over the people that I love, I didn't want to be that person. I already knew enough about my character and values that I knew that that is something I did not want to do. So I announced within about 48 hours that I was transitioning out of McKinsey. By now, let's say I've gone from 50 grand, because I leapfrogged through business school, and let's say I'm in that 225 range of comp. So I started to look for jobs, and given my personal circumstances, I was sucked into a job. There was a McKinsey partner who knew I was good, and he happened to be working at this mortgage company. So I ended up looking for a bunch of healthcare jobs, networking my way and meeting a bunch of hospital CEOs, but realizing that I could only make a certain amount of money at a hospital. My ability to create change at that hospital would be limited, and my max compensation would be limited a lot. So let's say if I started at 250, I probably couldn't go up much above 400 or 500 or 600, because that's what the CEOs and the COOs made. And at a COO level, so that's what the CEOs made. Again, in retrospect, there are many different ways to translate that skill into something bigger. But I decided not to go into the provider space, where I was mostly getting offers in LA. I ended up landing at this mortgage company, not realizing it would end up being a much longer lasting decision than I thought. And the way I got that job was this McKinsey partner tried to recruit me in. And it was because I had done a 3-month study engagement, like a research project, in my free time, not the actual official project, on outsourcing and the unbundling of the value chain across the globe, and the role of China and how all of that has sort of transpired. And this company, IndyMac, which was one of the large mortgage companies in America, wanted to figure out how to create a global workforce to bring their cost structure to be the lowest in the industry. And so he sucked me into that. Within a few months of that, I got a chance to make a presentation in front of a large group, where I had the chance to meet the CEO of IndyMac Bank. And I'm going to talk about comp here, because he was the one who I would say who pulled me up from the mid to high twos to the 800 to 900 grand range within 3 to 4 years. And so I would say he was the one who really taught me about compensation. And also I got very close to him. He and I got along like a house on fire. So I basically sat next to him and read all of his emails. And sort of became his trusted confidant, almost like like an extension of the CEO. And it was a really interesting job, because I was very reluctant. I came in to do this global resources thing, And within 6 months, he said, I'd like you to be my chief of staff. Now I was in a real conundrum. Do I want to be like the CEO's assistant, or do I want a real job running something? But he convinced me that it was going to be something more than just an admin job, because he viewed the job as an extension of the CEO. And while I was talking to him, I snuck in the thing about AV and my relationship and the fact that I was lesbian. And actually, I let it slip twice because, he was sort of like this white Republican guy. And I wasn't quite sure if he would be a comfortable person to work with. And he himself, then, without me saying anything, toward the end of the meeting, the interview with him, came back to say, I just want you to know that I don't care if you're lesbian. I'm completely okay with that. And all I care about is your performance. And so that was a great signal for me that this was the right person for me to work with. So I ended up working with Mike Perry, who had a huge role in building up this company that is now called One West Bank, but was then called IndyMac Bank. And he taught me a lot of stuff. When I was working with him, I saw everybody's compensation. So that's when my eyes started to open, because I saw the compensation of not only the top 10 people at the company, but the top 50, the top 100, the top 300. So now I could see at every level what everybody was getting paid. And I could see all the sycophants and the people who would come in and out of the office. And I could see who got paid more. It wasn't necessarily the highest performing people, okay, that were all the people that were working the hardest that paid more. And he told me this too. He said, if you want to be successful, Ray, two rules. One, you got to know the job of everybody who works for you better than you, right? And maybe you don't have to take that literally, but literally or figuratively. And secondly, he said, you got to make sure that you know how to communicate with and market with the person above you, because they are going to have a much bigger impact on your success than actually what you do and everybody that you interact with. So he really tuned me into the notion of working and choosing the right boss or the right person to work with, and communicating with them to expand your career. And he also, it was really interesting because we would watch, he was very much pro women and promoted several women into the C-suite. But he told me, he said, you got to ask for compensation to get it. You're never going to get anything that you don't ask for. And he would always point out how the women would never ask for money and how that was sort of the key. And so, and the way that I got money with him, because he was a stinge pot too, he wanted to make the company to make money, right? So the key for me to get my pay increased or tripled during those 4 years was I needed to do jobs, not the jobs that I wanted to do or that I thought was the most interesting or sexy, head of strategy, head of M&A, those kinds of things. I needed to go do the jobs that he or the company needed me to do, where the business had pain that it needed solving. And whenever I did that, I was able to negotiate for myself a substantial increase in compensation for either taking that job, or within 3 to 6 months, I would say, if I accomplish certain things, can I get the next level of compensation? And so with him, I went from being first vice president of global resources to senior vice president of global resources, to being senior vice president, CEO, chief of staff, to being head of HR, because we used to spend 700 million a year on people, labor. And yet he always felt that HR was the most poorly run function in the company. So I said, fine. He wanted to have HR run as a business. I had no HR background and I jumped right in, became head of HR. Then he said, I like what you're doing in HR. I'd like you to be chief administrative officer in charge of our $1 billion of expense and all of our people, 10,000 people we had at the time. And so this was a progression with a lot of, I think, phenomenal lessons for comp. And for progression, because that was, I would say, the speediest acceleration up the chain. But it was only because I was in the right place. The market was growing. The company was growing. If the company is not growing, no matter how well you do and how great you are with your boss, you're not going to see that growth. So the company was growing, the market was growing, and I was in a position to make a difference on key inflection points for the company. Then disaster hit. 2008, the crisis started, and a US senator leaked a letter expressing concern about our financial health to the Wall Street Journal. And lo and behold, we had hundreds of people lining up outside our bank. And so I'll try to fast forward because I'm not going that fast. I to leave IndyMac. In 2000, the FBI came in. They walked Mike Perry out. They announced a very large number for the number that they thought they would lose on the bank. And I realized that that number was way in excess of anything that we thought it should be, we being management who understood everything about the company. I also understood very well that there was no fraud at our company. of any significance at the senior levels, because I had been so intimately part of all of the meetings that I knew the truth of what had gone on. And so I decided I was going to leave and I was going to go, I had gone to Princeton and Northwestern for free, one way or another. Somebody else had paid for it. And so I thought I have a moral obligation to help my country, because now I was like, pretty close and sitting at one of the most pivotal housing enterprises, seeing everything happen. And I ended up having, coincidentally, being on the board of the LA Public Housing Authority for about 6 years. So I saw, the second largest public housing agency in the country, and was a part of turning that around. And my now wife had a real estate brokerage. So I thought I have like this incredible knowledge. I've got to bring it to DC, because I've had this incredible life that I could have never even had in my own country. And I've been able to succeed despite having a very untraditional persona. So I have a moral obligation to help my country. So then I spent about 4 years with my own consulting company, hit some really tough times, by the way. I had made the silly mistake. Well, first of all, I took all of my compensation at IndyMac, those big numbers, in stock. Because I was like, I'm only 28, 30 years old. I've got a long way to go. Let's ride this company on the way up. And then when the times got hard, I put my 401k into the IndyMac stock too. And so times got pretty tough. I had this sort of attitude that I don't have very many needs. I can go make as much money as I want. And so I quit my job and just started to kind of run down savings and started traveling to DC, writing white papers. And with the help of a few high-placed friends, like my McKinsey mentor, who in 2008 happened to be leading President Obama's transition into office, and a very good friend of mine who happened to be good friends with the Obamas and know a lot of people at the Black Caucus. I was actually able to get audiences and try to, get involved in sort of policy making on foreclosure prevention and short sales and, various housing programs to stabilize the housing market and help consumers avoid foreclosure and pain. And so I call that the 4 years that I finally, sort of earned my American education or my American stripes, so to speak. But at the same time, by now, I one day had to call one of my best friends who was at IndyMac, where my mortgage was, and I had to tell him, "Hey, buddy, I need a loan modification. I need a forbearance. I can't pay my mortgage. My savings are down. I haven't been earning any money. I've been flying to DC." And we've been starting to spend more money, because by now I'm in my 30s, and my wife and I decided to have kids. And so he was very kind, and he put me on a forbearance plan, and I started to do more consulting gigs to make sure that I had a steady source of income. And then basically my wife got pregnant with our second set of twins in 2012. And by that time, my expenses were skyrocketing. And I realized that the consulting business is a pretty challenging business to try to make a lot of money in, because every hour, people just don't want to pay you that much per hour. Where I could easily make, I was making 800-900 grand, $1 million earlier. No, people aren't going to pay me $500 an hour, which is essentially what that translates into. So I realized it's a pretty tough deal to make a bunch of money doing consulting. So I went to the couple of mentors of mine. By the way, I didn't have I had this one mentor who wasn't a mentor when he was at McKinsey. He's an amazing individual. I won't take his name, but he's played a big role in some of the California business policies as well. And he started in a McKinsey social sector practice. And I said, "Hey, will you be my mentor? I know we never worked together, but I've always respected you, and I'd love to have your support." And you'd be shocked when you ask people, even if they're audaciously out of reach, if they would help you out. You'd be surprised at how often they will say yes. And so I went to him and I said, "What do you think I should do? I think they should make me HUD secretary. Should I, you think there's a chance of that happening? And, how would I, or should I go make money? Because now I have 4 kids and I have no money." And I realized that my ideas were to speak them in public. The conversation I had was, I sort of have this philosophy of truth telling and saying it the way I think it, saying what I think is right. And that wasn't appreciated by people even on the left, where I found myself more aligned. I found myself attacked even by my lefty progressives if I came up with contrarian ideas or untraditional ideas that were not in sync with what they thought should happen. And so I realized, I should keep my mouth shut and learn how to monetize my ideas in a different way than speaking them out publicly, which I know is very contrary to what's happening on social media, but that's worked very well for me, I would say overall. So I went to this advisor and he said, "Look, Ray, you should go make money. If you want to go become HUD secretary, that's a very long shot, but it's a shot. I'd done a lot of work by now. I'd done consulting in San Antonio. So I was making money the very hard way in consulting. but I'd done some really cool affordable housing work in San Antonio and affordable housing. So I had a lot of experience. He said, maybe you could do it, but you got to go run a nonprofit agency, go run a nonprofit or a public agency and go raise a bunch of money. And I decided, you know what, that's not my track. First of all, I can't actually pay for my family with a nonprofit salary. And secondly, I don't want to go do a bunch of fundraising. I'm going to go do what I do best, which is build things, make things happen, be a capitalist, so to speak. And I also decided now, after 4 years of bumping my head against every local, state, and federal agency I could, I sort of came to this realization that I'm going to try to make my social change through capitalism. I'm not going to try to do it through nonprofits. I just didn't see nonprofits having scalability. I didn't see them actually, I saw them having a political voice and power, but I saw very few of them actually having impact. And I didn't see very many government people either that were interested in making long-term great decisions. And so I just decided I'm not going to fight that fight. I'm going to try to do what I do best and create change through social enterprise. So to fast forward, because it's getting to maybe another 5 minutes, I had a choice. I hit a fork in the road. What I hadn't realized was by 4 years being out of the market, my value in the market had declined. So now I started to look for jobs, and it was like, oops, the mortgage sector, the mortgage industry has moved outside of Southern California. 2008, let's say there's 10 of the top 20 mortgage companies in SoCal. By the time 2012 hits, most of the jobs have moved to Texas or Florida. And there's just not a whole lot of options here. So I basically got some big company options. I could have gone to a big company, at an SVP or EVP level. I would have had to take a 20 to 30% pay cut for trying to do the right thing. But I could go do that. But I would have to move. Orange County, Arizona, Ohio, New York. Or I could go do something different and try to build my own track. I basically decided that I'm not going to go work at a big company anymore. I don't want to spend, one of the reasons I'd left IndyMac and sort of, I'd always felt this entrepreneurial thing is I just don't want to be doing, I thought at one point, if I'm 65 years old and I'm like a senior McKinsey partner, will I feel like it was a life well lived? By the way, I've changed my opinion on that now, but as a young person, I said, yes, I said, no, it's not going to feel like a life well lived. I want to do something more. And so I sort of had that same conversation, and I didn't want to go into the C-suite and start playing politics again. And so in the meantime, I basically what I ended up doing was I found these entrepreneurs, or they found me, because I'd also been working along the way. I'll mention one more thing on storytelling, because I realized that earlier in my career, a lot of my communication and the way that I conducted myself was focused on the head, on numbers, on analyses. But as I went to DC, as I went to the White House, as I went to speak at conferences and try to create change, I realized that I got a lot more impact. I could gain a lot more success in selling my story if it was a story and if I was a great communicator. So I actually started to really study the art of communication and the start of and sort of study the art of influence. And essentially, basically, I would go speak at these conferences about foreclosure prevention, and I launched some training program. I just did a whole bunch of random stuff, which at a big picture level didn't amount to much, but was a great learning. And I ran into these entrepreneurs who basically, and to cut a long story short, they had failing businesses which they did not know how to run, and they desperately needed somebody like me who could talk a good game and also make stuff happen. So the first thing that I did was I went and worked with this incredible entrepreneur who really taught me to be a salesperson. This gentleman who'd formed a law firm called A-Law and a data company which scraped data off of the court records and sold them to banks and services. And yeah, long story short, I started with him again to layer it into comp a little bit. I started right back at where I had started at IndyMac with a part-time job. And within a couple of years of working, where I started as a consultant for one company, I then ran the first company, and soon he had me running the second company, because one of the companies was headed within a mothership completely and bleeding cash, like 200 grand a month. So basically, I would say, turned from being a C-suite chief administrative, intelligent type, actual leader and CEO, when I was put into a situation of running first a $10 million business, a $70 million business of about 500 people, which was just simply failing. It was losing money every single month. And there was nobody who knew how to turn it around. So I basically took the opportunity I just jumped in and said, I'll do it. And I negotiated along the way as I changed my role and took on more responsibility, went back to the old principle and negotiated step function increases in This time, my goal was both to get enough to pay for my family's monthly expenses. With 4 young kids under 3, we needed like 2 nannies at one point, etc. And also lost a bunch of time doing various things. I wanted to have equity upside so I could build wealth because our wealth had gone down to zero in the housing crisis. And so, thankfully, the oversight experience was very successful. And the lesson I got out of that, that I learned how to do, is to sell. I learned relationship-based sales. That if you take the time to work hard, talk to your clients, tell them the truth, ask them for second chance. I started with a law firm that had all of the clients in the banking sector, but it was ranked in the bottom 10%. And so what I do was I basically move the performance up by first putting a reporting system to understand and figure out how to move the revenues numbers and the expense numbers, okay, in a better direction. And with that, we were able to start to move the performance of the law firm up, and I had to go basically run around all over the country with my boss and partner, who happened to have a couple of private planes. That's what I love to do. That's part of the art of selling, is like, people, feeding people, taking them to events, being a little excessive. And so I would say I learned from him. That situation forced me to be an entrepreneur. It forced me to be an operator. It forced me to sell. And I ate humble pie. I was like a big guy at McKinsey who wouldn't travel more than a certain amount. And I only did projects in a certain radius. And I didn't do red eyes and all of this stuff. And basically, as I grew up and as I lost everything and had to rebuild it, all of that went out the window. And I did whatever it took. For about 2 years, I took a Sunday night red eye to Tampa every week, and either the Thursday or the Friday night flight back to see my wife and kiddos, to be able to accomplish what I needed to do, because that was the only opportunity that I could get that gave me the right cash and the right equity upside. Then I decided a couple of years in that it didn't make sense for me and us to move to Tampa. It's a conservative state. I have an unconventional family. And I could see like a little brotherhood forming in this company's, where a couple of other best friends of my partner came in. And I could see that now that the turnaround was done, my power was declining, because I always realized that the power that you have to negotiate whatever it is that you need is when the company needs you. When their level of need on you and reliance on you goes down, then your influence in the company goes down. It's not something to take personally. It's just sort of a fact of life. So now in the background, I always know, when I go in and big things happen and people are like, "You're amazing." I'm like, okay, honeymoon period. So I know I'm going to go through sort of a cycle in all of my relationships, and instead try to step out of that and be a bit more strategic. So then I had to do it again. I got a job this time in LA with a couple of more entrepreneurs who were incredible salespeople. They had this company called Genesis Auction and another company called Genesis Capital. And one of their companies, Genesis Capital, had a $250 million capital commitment from Oaktree Capital. And so I thought, oh, this big private equity firm has invested in these people. They must be okay. So I took this job again, running two companies, because that's the only way I could get the base salary that I needed. And Oaktree was too stingy, so I couldn't live on the salary they would pay me. But these two companies combined, which were owned by these entrepreneurs, would pay me what I needed and give me enough upside, so I could get not like 0.1% of the company, but like 3 or 5 or 10% of the company. So I got that in both of these companies, and I took them over. And to cut a long story short, we ended up getting lucky after a period of time, and we ended up. I'll go back and tell you the story of these, but we ended up merging Hudson and Marshall, Genesis Auction, into this other company, Hudson and Marshall. Both money-losing companies merged together onto a single platform with a good strategy and some energy, started to make money. We sold that to Fidelity National Financial 2017. So now I'm starting to see some wealth creation events. And then I took Genesis Capital, and we took that from being an LA-focused lender and scaled that nationwide. And since I'd been at IndyMac, I knew how to convert a non-bank lender to a bank lender. And so I created like a one-of-a-kind, very interesting business. And we were able to sell that to Goldman in 2018. Then, along the way, one of my best friends from IndyMac, I'll try to wrap up here in a couple of minutes so we can do some Q&A. One of my best friends from IndyMac had kept in touch with me through all of this thick and thin. He was a tech entrepreneur before he came to IndyMac. He took a break, wanted to spend time with his kids, so he came to IndyMac. And then we moved him to India because he ended up running global resources when I became head of HR and all that. So he ended up being on my team. So he came to me in about 2013 and said, "Hey, Ray, me and my longtime partner, Sam, think that the tech revolution has come to biology. because the human genome has been mapped and it's 3 billion base pairs, meaning data and technology are necessary to exploit the advances in genomics. And, we think nobody's going to bring all this stuff to our families in India and do it affordably and work to make it cheap. So we're going to form this genomics company. And he told me he was going to put in this much money of his own. Now, I knew Mahesh really well, and I knew that he came from a very low income family and had very little. He's another IIT guy who got to IIT with nothing, couldn't even buy extra books when he was younger, and really built everything with a very thoughtful, conservative attitude. And I thought, if Mahesh is putting in this much of his net worth, I should put in I've now saved up, a couple $100,000 from my earnings from all these companies. I'm going to put it all in and see where it goes. Because I just felt a confidence that he's not going to let it go. He's not going to lose the money. And so that ended up being a phenomenal bet. And then slowly but surely, they started to form more companies. They said, we want to do the same thing in agriculture. We think we can build new seeds in India. Why don't you invest in that? Then they came to me for a third one. So I started to slowly funnel money into these companies, including when I got these exit events that were involved in genomics and protein engineering. And he convinced me philosophically that I should, because I'm a big social entrepreneur, I want to make a difference in the world. And I'm not that motivated by money. It's not about having a big house and a plane and all of these things. But I also did realize that money is a very necessary thing to master if you want to be able to accomplish those things, because I felt pretty weak and vulnerable when I was doing it in 2008 and to 2012 without the dough. And so I decided that what I was going to do was work to lower my expenses. Even as my compensation went up, we created a budget in 2012 that went up to 2020. And it involved founding a charter school and keeping our kids in public school and winding down our expenses and paying our debt off, and sort of this whole journey where expenses were down and I could be free. If I made a certain amount of money, then I'm free to do whatever I want. And so basically, I took one more job because of my friend Mahesh and my friend Tony, who runs Mr. Cooper, the mortgage affiliate of Zoom, which I ran. They needed a CEO. And, they say sometimes that women CEOs get a job of a CEO when they can't find a guy to do it. And I don't know if, I can certainly 100% say that here, but my feeling is this was kind of one of those jobs because they'd had about 3 or 4 CEOs since this company had been formed. And it was a pretty substantial company, about a $500 million company. It happened to be losing money and had been declining for several years, and they just needed somebody. And it turned out that this combination of things I'd done between the law firm and this data company and this auction company and this other thing, it was like just a magical combination. So I understood all elements of this business that they needed turned around. And I just fell in love with the culture of this company and what they were trying to do. It was a terrible company with a bad reputation in 2008, 2010. And the guy who runs it, Jay Bray, was doing this amazing job rebranding it, but fundamentally changing it from the inside into a very employee and customer-oriented company. So I ended up doing one more gig, but I did that with Jay knowing that I would basically come do this for a couple of years and then go on to emerge, to go pursue my long-term dream of trying to make a social impact and reconnect with India in a way that's different. I had to give up my original dream when I was younger of trying to be connected to my culture and people, but here I could connect in a different way, still live in America because I don't think that's viable, but make a meaningful contribution. And so I sort of exited the Zoom job once we got a success going, and became a part of the thing I'm doing now. And I'll share more numbers if people want, but suffice it to say that I took a 93% pay cut because I got up all the way to 4 million a year at Zoom. That's actually a public number. So, and I can tell you about how I negotiated that. But I got all the way up to 4 mil a year in my Zoom job, and then I didn't build up to that lifestyle. I never assumed I would make that, and so my goal was more to make a certain amount of net worth, and then to be able to pay our expenses and be safe, and then become an entrepreneur. And so I took a 90+% pay cut from a cash basis, but I have a huge equity upside, and I came into a set of ventures which are not designed to be a couple, 2-3 years long, but more like a decade or 2 decade long. Because even if you want to create a new drug, that takes 10 years. And so it's a much, like we've been working on this rice. We have this new rice variety that we've developed that is like a leapfrog, hugely more productive than the rice that's consumed in South India, but that's taken us 4 or 5 years. And so, so I'm now trying to play the long game and also do it in a way where I can over time start to spend more time with the kiddos. So I'm not just working before they all go off to college in 8 or 10 years. So I'll wrap it up and stop sharing the screen here and open it up to Q&A.